For this one, we're going back to the 1960s when a beautiful young heiress is buried alive. For a brutal 83 hours, Barbara Jane Mackle is trapped in a ventilated box underground. She's being held for ransom by a 23-year-old con man and his grad student mistress. And just when her story ends, the con man's story is just getting started. So what happened to these people? Let's recap. All right, so here's where Barbara Jane Mackle's nightmare begins. She's a 20-year-old economics major at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Christmas break is coming up. She just has to get through her finals, but that's easier said than done. See, Barbara has a nasty case of the Hong Kong flu, and this isn't just some seasonal bug. This flu pandemic is claiming millions of lives worldwide. So when she gets sick, it's serious. So mom drives up from Florida to Georgia to take care of her little girl. She takes her out of her dorm so she doesn't get everybody else sick, and they hole up at the Roadway Inn Motel just off campus. They've been there for about 4 days, and then around 4 a.m. they hear a knock at the door. A voice on the other side says, "I'm a detective. A boy driving a white Ford has been in an accident and he's asking for you." He's talking about Stuart Woodward. He's a friend of Barbara's. So her mom looks out the window and she sees a big guy in a policeman's hat. Now, interestingly, Barbara tells her, "Don't open the door," but mom unbolts it anyway. And that's when things go from strange to terrifying. Standing there is Gary Stephen Krist. He's this 23-year-old career criminal who stole that policeman's hat from a diner just like the day before or even that day. Right next to him is his accomplice, his 26-year-old mistress, Ruth Eisman Shear. They're both armed. He's got a gun, she's holding chloroform, and they're not wasting any time. They barge in, tie mom up. She plays like she's passed out from the chloroform, but she held her breath, so she's wide awake, and she sees them take Barbara out to the car. Now, Barbara's still in her nightgown, mind you. From there, they drive to this lonely spot in the Georgia woods that they prepped beforehand. Now, Barbara's in the back seat with her head on Ruth's lap. She's got no idea what's about to happen next. Now, meanwhile, back at the motel, her mom is screaming, desperate for help. She's like, manages to get outside. She's laying on a horn, summoning help. And when I say help, I mean she gets serious backup. We're talking President Nixon himself and the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Why are these two getting involved? Because the Mackles are like Florida royalty. Now, Barbara's dad, Robert Mackle, he isn't just some rich guy. He's a millionaire real estate developer from a family of millionaire developers. These are the people who literally built some of Florida's most well-known communities. If you live there or been there or from there, you definitely know these places. His father developed Key Biscayne. Robert, along with his brothers, are part of the Deltona Corporation, which is responsible for some other places you've definitely heard of. Marco Island, Port Charlotte, Port St. Lucie, and the city of Deltona. I mean, these are some heavy hitters. Clearly, Barbara is no broke college kid. She's a debutante with a capital dollar sign. So when she goes missing, it's not just the local cops on the case. It's the highest levels of power in the country coming together to bring Barbara home. But while the whole country is watching and hoping for her rescue, her nightmare is only just beginning. See, Barbara isn't too far from the motel this whole time. She's only about 20-ish miles away. But honestly, they might as well have stashed her on the moon. She is that impossible to find. Because Gary buried her alive in this wooden box he designed himself. This isn't just some random crate. It's a 7-foot long, 3-foot wide, 3.5-foot deep plywood coffin lined with fiberglass cloth. Now, Gary isn't just some thug. He knows his way around electronics, and he's rigged this thing up with a few essentials. Inside, she has a blanket, a little food, some toilet paper, and a bucket thing for bathroom time, which I don't understand how that works. He left her a note, like, stay calm, here's what's going to happen, you're going to be home by Christmas either way, which it kind of implies that he was going to let her go if they didn't pay up, but also in spirit, you're going to be home. It's scary. But, like, who cares about all those amenities if you didn't have two very important things? Two breathing hoses poking out just above ground. Like, not enough that anybody would see them necessarily or wonder, but just enough that she can breathe. That little box is her world now. And let's not forget she's got the flu, which is brutal enough even if you're cozy in bed, but you're buried underground with the flu. And with every hour that ticks by, her odds of survival get smaller and smaller. Now let's get to know Gary Krist a little bit better. Now, right up until a few weeks before this point, he's living in a trailer in Florida with his wife and two kids. Then there's Ruth Eisman Shear. She's a girl he met just a few months before this. She's along for the ride, but make no mistake, Gary is the mastermind here. He spends hours at the library, flipping through the society pages, researching rich heiresses who are tough enough to handle being buried alive. And that's how he zeroes in on Barbara. So Gary's only 23, right? But he has basically already lived half his life practically behind bars. He grew up in this tiny fishing village in Alaska called Pelican, Alaska. By the time he's 9, everyone already knows him as the local troublemaker. He spends his teenage years stealing cars, bouncing in and out of juvie. Now, somewhere along the line, he ends up in California. He meets a girl at a roller rink, gets married, and knocks her up. And then almost immediately, he's busted for car theft, and he gets a 5-year sentence. But here's the thing about Gary. He's not the kind of guy who's just going to sit around and serve his time. After 8 months, he's like, I'm done. And he hatches this bold escape plan with another inmate. Now picture this. 2 razor wire fences, armed guards, the works. But somehow Gary manages to make it out alive. Even though his partner isn't as lucky, that guy gets killed in the escape. But from there, Gary moves his little family to Boston. Somehow, he talks his way into a research job at MIT, of all places. Gary's a smooth talker. He's also very smart, and he's been working with electronics in prison. He grows a beard. That's his big disguise. He starts calling himself George Deacon, and bam, he's got this brand new life. He's staying out of trouble, for a while at least, and then someone at MIT recommends him for this job at the University of Miami. And by June of 1968, he and his family are down in Florida. They're in this trailer, they're blending in, but he's still dreaming of that one big score that'll set him up for life. All right. Fast forward to September, and Gary's a technician on the University of Miami's Marine Science Institute research boat. So he's out on a 2-week research trip to Bermuda with a bunch of grad students, and one of those students is Ruth Eisman Shear. She's 26. She's a marine scientist from Honduras, and she's the whole package. She's charming, she's smart, she's popular. Over those 2 weeks, sparks fly, and by the end of the trip, the two of them are all in. But they're kind of keeping it a secret because nobody really knew that they were still together when they got back. So 3 weeks before Christmas, Gary breaks the news to his wife. I don't love you anymore. Get out. Basically. So she packs up, takes their 2 kids, and heads back to California. And Ruth steps in. Now, how long has Ruth known about this plan? I'm not totally clear on that, but we do know that Ruth is all in. So Gary's been busy building this human-sized box in his workshop at the University of Miami. So he and Ruth, on December 14th, load this box up in his Volvo. Like, it's hanging out the back. It's crazy. And they make the 12-hour drive up to Emory University in Georgia. Fun fact here. They check into the Roadway Inn motel. Pure coincidence. They have no idea that Barbara and her mother are there too. They only find out later when they talk to people at her dorm. From there, it's easy. Gary calls the motel. He just asks for Mrs. Mackle's room, and then he tells her he's got a certified letter to deliver and he needs her room number. And then, just before dawn on December 17th, knock, 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 it's game time. That same morning, after they've got Barbara tucked away in her special box in her hole in the ground, Gary calls the Mackle house and he tells them, go out to the yard. I buried some instructions under a rock in your yard. Super creepy. If you're going to pay the ransom, put an ad in the Miami Herald tomorrow morning. The next morning, December 18, the ad is in the personals. It reads, Loved one, please come home. We will pay all expenses and meet you anywhere at any time. Your family. The ransom drop is set up for a spot on Biscayne Bay, not far from the Mackle mansion in Coral Gables. Now, Gary comes in by boat and grabs it, but when he meets up with Ruth in the Volvo in another area, they get busted. They're acting so suspicious that someone calls the cops. So the FBI is in on it, but they didn't tell the local police. So when the cops show up to question Ruth and Gary, like, what are you doing here? You know, that kind of thing. They have no idea that they're actually interrupting a ransom drop for like this missing heiress, top news story in the country. One thing leads to another. The bad guys make a run for it. They leave their Volvo behind with all their identifying information in it. From there, Ruth gets on a bus for Houston, Texas, leaving Gary to keep going after the money by himself. The second ransom drop goes as planned, and Gary makes off with $500,000 in $20 bills. And true to his word, once he has the cash, Gary calls the FBI and he gives them the coordinates of where Barbara is buried. Oh, agents rush to the spot, frantically digging her out, and luckily she's okay. Maybe all that sleep helped clear up her flu bug. But she's a little dehydrated and a few pounds thinner, but other than that, she's fine. In fact, she says she's absolutely wonderful. She's just happy to be here, to be home with her family for Christmas. You know? But where are her kidnappers? Gary decides to take a boat to Texas to meet up with Ruth. So he buys one in cash in West Palm Beach the morning after he gets the money. But this is the biggest story in the country right now. Everyone knows the kidnapper got paid in 20s. So when Gary counts out 145 $20 bills to buy a boat, and his picture is in the papers, well, the boat guy calls the feds and they start patrolling the waterways in Florida. They catch him around midnight in a marsh near Fort Myers, and they recover almost all the ransom. But where's Ruth, right? Well, thanks to her love affair with Gary, she becomes the first woman ever to make the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Now, if it was me, I would have left the country like, run, girl. But Ruth sticks around. 79 days later, they catch her in Oklahoma when she applies for a job because she has to submit her fingerprints for a background check. Now, back in Georgia, a jury gives her 7 years for the part she played. She does 4, and then she gets deported back to Honduras, where she still lives today. But what about Gary? What happens to him? Well, stay with me because here's where it gets even crazier. At his trial, the prosecution is pushing for the death penalty. I mean, sure, Barbara lives, but she was buried in a box for almost 4 days, and that's diabolical. But, you know, he did tell the feds where to find her, and she's okay. So a jury votes for mercy. They give him life. But Gary is smart, right? And he's not about to just do his time. So he makes a big effort to appear reformed. Of course, he apologizes to Barbara, he goes to church, he tutors other inmates, but most importantly, he buddies up to the chairman of the Georgia Parole Board. He says he's going to go back to Alaska and work on his family's fishing boats, and he won't be a bother to anybody. Or, you know, maybe he's going to be a missionary, but he's for sure going to do something worthwhile with his freedom if the parole board lets him out. And in 1979, they do. So basically, he does 10 years after he buries a girl alive. And he decides that he wants to be a doctor. A doctor. He's been studying up in prison. He's like, I can do it. But since he's a lifelong criminal, he can't get into med school. Not unless he gets a pardon, which he manages to talk his way into getting. So with the state of Georgia behind him, you're pardoned, all is forgiven. He goes to medical school in Mexico. But every time he applies for a residency in the U.S., they're like, Gary Krist of the Barbara Mackle kidnapping? No thanks, man. But never say never, because buckle up. Gary Krist's story just gets wilder. By 2001, he somehow lands himself a job as the town doctor. Now, the town knows he's got a record, but they're desperate. They haven't had a doctor in ages, and they're like, why not? Let's give this guy a shot. And for 2 years, it works out until the local papers dig into his past and blow his cover with a story about the kidnapping. Once it hits the news, he's out of there. So what does he do next? Well, apparently he decides his best option is to become a drug kingpin. Here's how that goes down. Right around the time Indiana hands him a medical license, he and his stepson set up a construction company in Georgia. On paper, they're building bulletproof rooms, but they've got another specialty going on. In 2004, they sail down to Colombia, buy a kilo of cocaine, and start selling it back in Georgia. And here's the kicker. Georgia people, it's the very state that once insisted he was reformed, let him out, gave him a pardon, and now he's on the streets dealing drugs. But he doesn't stop there. Every time he makes the trip to Colombia, he's like an investment in his Colombian drug future. He comes back with more and more and more. It's like he's building his own little cartel in Georgia. By 2006, he's busted with 14 kilos and 4 undocumented immigrants who paid him to smuggle them into the U.S. It gets weirder because when they search his place near Auburn, Georgia, they find this underground drug lab hidden under a trap door in his backyard shed. This man loves it underground. The whole thing's wired up with electricity. It's got running water. It even has an escape tunnel that leads like 30 feet away from the lab. It's like out of a movie. Everything this man does is out of a crazy movie. So naturally, he's back in prison after all of this. But then in 2010, they let him out on parole again. And here's the crazy part. I don't know, after all this, is this the crazy part or is just this is expected? He's still out. He's still a free man. He's still living in Georgia to this day. And like whatever happened to Barbara, right? His victim, she ends up marrying the very guy that Gary pretended was in an accident to get her and her mom to open the motel room door that night, Stuart Woodward. They settled in the Atlanta area. They had 2 kids. They built a life together. And then after her husband passes, she eventually returns to Florida. Who knows? Maybe I could not live in Georgia after all that. I couldn't even look at a box or get in an elevator. But Gary did his homework right. Barbara was strong enough to handle it. She did it. The only time she really talked about it in depth was in 1971 when she co-authored a book about it called 83 Hours Till Dawn. Obviously, it made waves. It's crazy. There are even a couple of movies based on her story. But after that, she never really talked publicly about it again. If you like getting all the crime in half the time, it would mean so much to us if you gave this a like and absolutely remember to subscribe. I'm Amy. My husband Chris and I are here 3 times a week with new recaps, and we're always taking suggestions. So if you've got something that you want to talk about, leave it in the comments and we'll add it to the list.